Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is October 27th, 2016, and you're listening to episode 5. Politicos is the podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and around the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Now let's dive into the big story this week is the Wallonians. Wallonians? How do you even say it?
I have no idea.
The people no one had heard of from Belgium effectively killed the CETA agreement before it passed again. Maybe you want to fill us in?
Yeah, so we touched on this briefly a couple episodes ago, but basic background, this has been an agreement that's been in the works for 8 years. It was finalized 2014. It's going to remove 98% of all tariffs between Canada and the EU. It's got approval by the trade ministers and it's currently awaiting ratification by the EU member nations. And that is where Wallonia comes in. Because of the structure of Belgium's very regional nature, each regional legislature has to ratify the agreement. And the French-speaking Wallonia has thrown up some roadblocks on there and refused to ratify the agreement, primarily citing concerns over foreign competition and the investor-state dispute settlement, as well as concerns over whether or not they'd be able to effectively regulate their own markets.
And so this all sort of came to a head when Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of International Trade, was in talks in Belgium, I believe, and she stormed out of the meeting, releasing this scathing press release, essentially calling the CETA agreement dead in the water because of the Walloons and the Wallonia people. And that immediately, I think, sent a Google search spike into what is this? Because when I first saw it, I thought it was a sort of satire of, I'd never heard of this, and I lived in Europe, so my apologies to all our Wallonian listeners.
Yeah, I think a lot of people on both sides of the pond have been frantically trying to figure out what the hell Wallonia is.
And so there's this question mark, and there was a lot of conservative hand-wringing saying, we fought for so long to get this deal, why can't the Liberals close the deal? Why can't they figure this out? I heard Ronna Ambrose on the radio talking about how Justin Trudeau should be on a plane right away because Stephen Harper would have been on a plane to Europe to fix this and solve it right away. And where's the Liberal commitment to free trade? It was that sort of virtue signaling obsessive. We have to do something without being really clear about what you could do differently.
Yeah, the opposition have definitely, or at least the conservative opposition has definitely reacted pretty strongly to this. The NDP's been rather silent on the issue, but they've never really met a trade agreement they actually like, so it's not particularly surprising.
I think Tom Mulcair was generally supportive of CETA. He'd come around to that one. He's more hawkish, let's say, about TPP, some of the more controversial ones, but from the Canadian standpoint, CETA has sort of reached the NAFTA level of public...
General acceptability.
Yeah, general acceptability.
It's the EU that's been, I think, more contentious for... They haven't been having the smoothest go in the last few years over unity, and having a small region of a small country kind of blocking major deal for them has been a little embarrassing in the wake of Brexit.
But nevertheless, despite Chrystia Freeland's storming out in all the flash and pomp and circumstance, the news that came out this morning was the Belgian people and the Belgian governments had been in talks sort of ongoing since that incident and have managed to sort of clear up the major contentions that the Walloons have, potentially just by clarifying the language you were saying.
Yes, there's an early draft document out now, basically clarifies the existing provisions, doesn't add much new in there. It more or less says, yes, the local governments can still regulate their industries, clarifies some of the language around the investor-state dispute agreements. Yeah, so this has primarily been clarifying the language. I saw one person describe it as more educating the Wallonians than changing the agreement.
It looks like the full text in the agreement could be through the next hurdle as soon as tomorrow afternoon, which means by the time I've finished editing this podcast, it may already be done.
Well, it still has to then be... This is an annex to the agreement. It's going to have to be ratified and agreed to by the EU member nations and us, but I don't really, the little bits of the text I have seen, I haven't seen anything that should be controversial on that, and probably sail through. But I think it does kind of highlight some of the misconceptions that sometimes surround parts of these trade agreements, and the Wallonians did kind of latch on to some of those misconceptions in their opposition. Particularly the investor-state dispute agreements often get mischaracterized, and it appeared to be the case in this situation as well.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what further roadblocks can get thrown up in the way out of nowhere. But that said, it's a way to give voice to opposition, and it hopefully helps bring about that more clarification that if there are those concerns, and they do manage to stumble a deal like this for a couple days, that can at least bring about a more informed debate rather than these things just being done behind closed doors and generating further conspiracies and that sort of mistrust of institutions that's overly rampant these days.
There's definitely a rise in protectionist sentiment, and it's nice to see that this manages to clear a hurdle of that. As Christopher Freeland pointed out, if the EU and Canada can't agree to a trade agreement, who can? Both are similar in terms of regulation, general living standards, all that sort of stuff. There is no major disconnect between the two countries that has to be addressed. Back here at home, there hasn't exactly been uncontroversial. Gary Ritz, the conservative trade critic, suggested Christopher Freeland required some adult supervision. His actual quote, since the trade minister is incapable or unwilling to do her job and ratify this vital trade deal, will the prime minister grab some adult supervision, get on a plane, go back over to Brussels and get this job done? I
mean, this repeats the sort of thing Ron Ambrose said, but almost in a more sexist way. It's at least a patronizing way.
Yes.
And I don't know if he'd have said the same thing about a male minister. Maybe he would have. Maybe he just thinks all liberals are infants and can't do their jobs. Because that's sort of how I think the Conservatives view the Liberals anyway, especially when Justin Trudeau is a younger man than many of their members and many of their voters, let's be honest. But it doesn't really say anything more. Like, what does he actually expect Justin Trudeau to do?
Yeah, about the only way to play even harder ball than walking out of the agreements would be trying to open up a parallel set of negotiations with Britain to really jam that sore spot of Brexit. Yeah, there's just really isn't anything to do, but you got to wonder about the line of attack on that, though. They managed to take a winning argument for them. Like, the Conservatives are strong on trade. That's been one of the areas where Canadians generally agree with them. It's been the file they've more or less owned, and managed to turn what should be a strong political moment for them into sympathy for the Liberals by going completely overboard here. They just never miss an opportunity by immediately ramping everything up to 11 on the hyperbole.
That's sort of been the trend of this entire parliament over the last year. You had Elbowgate, which was Justin Trudeau's mistake, bit everyone else because they'd all tripped over each other trying to show more umbrage and more outrage. So you just have to sometimes let the Liberals eat their own mistakes and not get in their way.
And there's a solid way you could run this thing. Conservatives are strong on trade. There's a decent question to be raised if you want to attack them on why was somebody who hasn't even served a full term in Parliament yet, Christopher Freeland was elected in a by-election during the last term, never held a ministerial position, for all intents and purposes, junior inexperienced minister, at least in political life. Well accomplished outside of it, but there's why did you put this inexperienced minister in charge of such an important file? You can tie it into Trudeau choosing style over substance, build that narrative. There's a way to attack this from the Conservative point of view that doesn't immediately lose any and all sympathy for your argument, and they just completely missed that.
Yeah, they got really hooked on this. Trudeau should be in Europe. It's almost like they're plotting a coup, then they just need him out of the country, and they're like, get him out. I'm not suggesting the Conservatives are traitors or trying to commit a coup, but it's just a really obsessive tone they've taken. Well, speaking of the Conservative Party, perhaps part of their problem is they don't have a permanent leader in place, and so they're still looking for that new voice. One of those people running for that leadership job who we've taken an interest in just because he puts out a lot of ideas that are interesting is Michael Chong. We criticized him last week over his discussion about wonky real estate reforms you can do at the federal level, which aren't that many. But this week he's got a little bit more interesting, and it goes back to stuff he's done and spoken about a lot in the past, which is democratic reform. We'll have our electoral reform deep dive episode coming out soon, but he's looking at more specific ways to make Parliament less partisan. So maybe you can talk about those, Scott.
Yes.
I know you've looked into them.
He's put forward a few proposals, both previously with his Reform Act and now as a candidate for leader of the Conservative Party. Key points are he'd remove the party leader's veto for candidates. Right now, in order to register as a candidate for a party in an election, you have to have your nomination papers signed by the party leader. And this is effectively a very powerful tool the party leaders have to enforce party discipline.
And it's not just a theoretical tool. It has been used frequently, both by every party, to reject people who've been nominated and won the local members' votes, and also to sort of parachute in star candidates.
Yes.
Sometimes for the better, sometimes for big question marks.
And it can keep MPs really afraid to move out of where the leader necessarily wants them to be on key issues, because, if you anger the leader too much, your career is essentially dead, because you're not going to be up for re-election, because they just won't sign your papers. So there's a definite issue there, and, well, it isn't the worst idea to have some sort of quality control check for a party on it. Is having the leader do it necessarily the strongest and best way to go about it, or will the negative side effects outweigh the benefits?
In Calgary, you had Rob Anders, who was widely hated within his own party, within his own constituency, because he was the guy who slept through Parliament, who called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, who basically every time he was in the news was doing something terrible that embarrassed all Canadians. But for some reason, Stephen Harper liked him and kept making him the candidate for his riding. So you had the entire Conservative Constituency Association in that riding try everything they legally could to get him out. And the only thing that worked was him retiring.
Yeah, so if this policy were to get implemented, you'd see both increased autonomy for MPs, better able to represent their constituency when that constituency's interests may not necessarily align with the party leader's interest. And you can also see a way to get rid of really unpopular candidates within a party. The other big components of the democratic reform policies Chong has pushed is he also wants to make all committee members selected by secret ballot of the MPs. Right now, they're assigned basically at the whim of the party leader, which, yet again, another big stick to hold over. Party leaders basically means committees vote the way the party leader does, not necessarily the way what's presented to them should necessitate them voting.
Yeah, committees are this invaluable part of our parliament that have done a lot of great work. Perhaps the downside of this is then you'd get even more independently minded committees that, well, that's not a downside. You'd have a government then have even less reason to listen to them because committees are non-binding. They can amend bills and try on some issues, but that doesn't force the government.
Yeah. And
at least it gives a sort of opposition and a chance to challenge and to have these discussions rather than just everything get rubber stamped by the PMO.
Yes, and there's some key oversight that the committees provide as well. Chong singles out the National Security Intelligence Committee that was put in place in part to address some of the oversight concerns around Bill C-51. But since it's staffed by the majority of people appointed directly by the PM who are essentially only answerable to him, it really doesn't provide an effective oversight. In addition to that, he's also proposing to select Senate Speaker and Senate Government Leader by ballot as well.
And he would also make the party leader subject to the support of the MPs.
Yes, the caucus.
So the next story that's come up in the last week is a couple bad news stories for the Trudeau government. On the one hand, his ministers have faced questions, particularly from the Globe and Mail and others, who are starting to look at events and meetings they're going to, where the people attending these meetings are paying $1,500 a plate or more.
Party fundraisers.
And they seem to be a cash for access type agreement where if you have enough money, you can be at the right place to talk to the right people. This is something every party's been criticized for. I know Christy Clark here in BC gets criticized for a lot because there's no restrictions on it.
And the Ontario Liberal Party is another one that's faced a lot of criticisms about this issue. And in fact, there's some concern here that a lot of the inner circle of the Trudeau government, particularly in the PMO, comes from Queen's Park and the current Liberal government there. And there's concerns that some of the bad habits picked up there may be making their way into federal politics too.
Yeah, at the federal level, you do have limits on how much any individual can donate to a political candidate or political party. And this sort of looks almost like a roundabout way to get around that. I know I heard one really bad defense of it saying, well, anyone can come to these events. They're open to the public. But as soon as you have a $1,500 price tag, I can't go. And then I guess the other story for Trudeau this week was he faced a really rough reception at the Canadian Labour Congress's National Young Workers Summit, where a number of protesters, I'm not sure about how many, but enough to make it a scene, sort of raised their voice against him, standing up, booing, turning their backs on him, not to get selfies, to actually signal that they're not approving of his status. And it's very striking when young people who were a core constituency of the Trudeau election make that sort of statement.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I think, a sign the honeymoon's coming to an end. Basically at the 1 year mark, a lot of people feel the promises haven't been kept, things aren't progressing the way they'd want them to, and I think that dissatisfaction's starting to bubble to the surface.
It might also just be the media is really bored of talking about honeymoon, and so they're just trying to find any little protest. It could be that there's always a number of people, specifically within the Labour movement, who hate the Liberal Party, and it wouldn't be hard to stage this kind of protest. It's not to say there isn't wide dissatisfaction, but the question's out there for me how
representative it is.
Exactly. And without strong opposition parties who have clear leaders, it's hard to say if it'll broaden beyond sort of some discontent at a few meetings. The next story is that in New Westminster, the Greens have actually just announced their candidate, and that's itself not that interesting, except the candidate they got is the former chair of the New Westminster School Board. I found this actually pretty interesting because it shows that the Green Party is able to reach beyond their sort of typical base and find some star candidates, particularly here in the lower mainland, where they have never really had a shot, but they've always had a sort of strong showing. This raises the question of whether there will be three-way races in some of the lower mainland seats.
Right, yeah. There's definitely some widespread dissatisfaction, I think, with both political main parties in BC. The Liberals have well overstayed their welcome and are getting that long in the tooth, scandalating reputation to them. So a lot of people are pretty dissatisfied. I don't want to come back to them next election coming up, but there's also a fair bit of dislike of the NDP, both from the 90s, where they managed to drive their popularity into the ground, collection of scandals and laden economy. So there's definitely a chance for there to be a centrist, resurgent Green Party coming up as a third vote there. And that's what Andrew Weaver's really been trying to do, is build out that sensible alternative. And this is a sign he's starting to catch on that.
Yeah, so candidate Jonina Campbell will be launching her campaign on November 2nd, and we'll be sure to follow her and all the other major candidates as they start to announce.
Okay, that's been Politicos. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod, and leave us a review and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Ian once more with a quick follow-up. This episode went quite a bit shorter than the last one, in part because we cut a few stories out and didn't get to talk about things like the new Senate appointments, and in part because we'd just finished recording a much longer discussion about electoral reform with Jackie from Lead Now. We're aiming to have that out early next week and similar deep dives each month, so look forward to that. But for now I want to ask two things of you. First, make sure to check out the show notes for this episode at politicos.ca for links to more about the stories we discussed. Second, if there's a hot topic that you think we missed or that comes up and you want to hear our thoughts on, send it to us by Twitter or Facebook, or just email us at podcast@politicos.ca and it will go to both Scott and me. So thanks for making it this far with us, and we hope to keep doing this long into the future.